I'm not a hero. I'm not even particularly brave. I'm a programmer. I spend my days staring at lines of code, wrestling with logic gates and syntax errors. My biggest battle, before all this, was getting a stubborn piece of JavaScript to run properly before a deadline. So when I finally scraped together every last cent from my savings and a small inheritance to buy my own house, it felt like the biggest achievement of my life. It wasn't much, to be honest. A small, single-story craftsman-style house on the edge of a quiet, older suburb. The kind of place with a decent-sized yard and neighbors who have lived there for 30 years. It cost me pretty much everything I had, but it was mine. No more landlords, no more paper-thin apartment walls where I could hear every argument my neighbors had. It was the American dream, or whatever version of it a guy on a coder's salary can afford. The place had good bones, as the realtor kept saying, which was a nice way of saying everything was 50 years out of date. The carpets were a faded, dusty rose color, the kitchen countertops were a sickly yellow formica, and the whole place had that old house smell. A mix of dust, faint mothballs, and forgotten memories. But I was excited, genuinely, truly excited. This wasn't just a house, it was a project. My project. I had big plans. I spent weeks watching DIY videos on YouTube, learning how to lay flooring, how to skim coat a wall, how to not electrocute myself changing a light fixture. The place was a blank canvas, and I was ready to pour all my pent-up creative energy into it. The first weekend after I got the keys was glorious. I spent the whole of Saturday just walking through the empty rooms, picturing it all. A big, comfortable couch right there in the living room. My WFH setup by the big window overlooking the backyard. My bed, a real bed, not a mattress on the floor, in the master bedroom. It felt like I was finally starting my life. I decided to start with the bedroom. It seemed like the most logical place. Get my sleeping space sorted, then work my way out. The first order of business was that hideous carpet. I spent a few hours pulling it up, cutting it into manageable strips, and rolling it out to the curb. Underneath was a subfloor and, beneath that, the original hardwood. It was scratched and dull, but it was there. My plan was to rip up the old boards, check the subfloor, and then lay down some new, clean-looking laminate. It was a big job, but I was full of energy. I put on some music, grabbed a pry bar and a hammer, and got to work. It was satisfying, physical labor. The creak and groan of each old plank coming loose, the smell of old wood dust filling the air. It was a total contrast to my day job, and I loved it. I was in a rhythm, working my way from the wall towards the center of the room. Pry, pull, stack. Pry, pull, stack. The afternoon sun was streaming in through the window, dust motes dancing in the light. It was peaceful, and then I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. In the middle of my rhythmic prying, my hammer blow was met not with the yielding splinter of wood, but with a dull, metallic thud. It was a dead sound, completely out of place. I stopped, the music from my phone suddenly seeming too loud. I paused it. Silence. I tapped the floorboard again with the hammer. Thud. Definitely metal. My first thought was a pipe. But that didn't make sense. Pipes would be running along the joists, not a flat sheet of metal sitting right under the floorboards in the middle of the room. Curiosity got the better of me. I worked the pry bar carefully around the spot, leveraging up the board. It splintered a bit, but it came free. And there it was. Underneath the hardwood was a square of dark, rusted metal. It was about 3 feet by 3 feet, with a recessed ring-shaped handle set flush with its surface. It was a trapdoor. I just stared at it for a long minute. A trapdoor, in the middle of the bedroom floor. It wasn't on the blueprints. I'd gone over them a dozen times at the county office before I closed the sale. Main floor, attic, a small crawlspace accessible from an outside vent. That was it. There was no mention of a cellar or a basement, let alone a hidden one in the master bedroom. A part of me, the logical, programmer part, told me to leave it alone. Nail the floorboard back down, cover it with the new laminate, and pretend it never existed. It wasn't part of the plan. But I couldn't. You know how it is. The itch you just have to scratch. Who hides a trapdoor under the floor of a house and doesn't tell anyone? I knelt down, my jeans getting dusty. I hooked my fingers through the metal ring. It was cold and gritty. I pulled. Nothing. It was stuck fast, either by rust or by design. I went to my toolbox and came back with a pry bar. I wedged the tip into the seam between the metal door and the surrounding frame and leaned on it with all my weight. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a god-awful, rusty groan, the seal broke. I was able to lift it an inch. The air that escaped was wrong. It was a blast of cold, damp air that smelled intensely of wet earth, of mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something stale and organic. It smelled like a place that hadn't seen the sun in a very, very long time. My heart was starting to beat a little faster now. This was moving from curious home renovation discovery to something a little more unsettling. I worked the pry bar around the edges, breaking the rest of the rusted seal, until I could get a good grip on the door. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. With a final heave, I lifted it up and swung it back on its creaking hinges. It clanged against the floor, and I was left staring down into darkness. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking just a little. I leaned over the opening, the foul smell washing over me. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing not a cellar, but a small, cramped tunnel. It wasn't finished or tidy. The walls were rough brick on one side and packed earth on the other. It was more of a burrow than a room, maybe 4 feet high, extending back into the darkness under the house, far beyond what the small opening revealed. My phone's light danced across the dirt floor just below the opening. And that's when I saw them. The first thing was a tricycle. A little red one, the kind every kid had 70 years ago. The chrome on the handlebars was pitted with rust, the red paint was flaking off, and one of the back wheels had fallen off. It was just sitting there, abandoned. A few feet from it, slumped against the brick wall, was a rag doll. Its yarn hair was a tangled, dirty mess, its button eyes seemed to stare blankly up into the darkness, and its calico dress was stained with dirt and what looked like mildew. A chill, completely unrelated to the cold air from the tunnel, went straight down my spine. What was this? Some kind of forgotten, makeshift playroom? A bomb shelter a family had dug out during the Cold War? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous owners had kids. Maybe this was their secret fort. It was a plausible explanation. A little weird, sure, but plausible. I kept sweeping the light deeper into the tunnel. It didn't seem to go that far, maybe 10 or 12 feet before it just ended in a dirt wall. There was nothing else, just dirt, dust, and those 2 sad, abandoned toys. I was about to dismiss it, to close the door and get back to work, when my light caught something on the brick wall next to the doll. Drawings. They were crude, drawn in what looked like charcoal, the kind of drawings a very young child would make. There was a lopsided sun, a boxy-looking house that was probably meant to be this one. And then there was a person. At least, I think it was a person. It was a stick figure, but it was all wrong. It was impossibly tall and thin, its arms and legs stretched out like bent twigs. Its head was just a small circle, with no features. It loomed over a much smaller, more normally proportioned stick figure. It looked like the smaller figure was holding its hand, and underneath the drawing, scrawled in messy, childish letters, were the words, "My tall skinny friend." I felt all the air leave my lungs. It was just so deeply strange. It wasn't just a kid's fort anymore. There was a story here, and it wasn't a happy one. The sad little tricycle, the filthy doll, and this drawing of a freakishly tall playmate. It felt wrong. It felt like I was looking at the evidence of some long-forgotten trauma. The optimism I'd felt all day, the joy of my new home, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, heavy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. With a grunt, I grabbed the heavy metal door and slammed it shut, the final clang echoing in the now silent room. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my jeans, my hands still trembling slightly. I told myself to forget it. It was from the past. Decades ago, probably. Some weird kid with an imaginary friend. It had nothing to do with me. I was going to lay a new subfloor, cover it with beautiful laminate flooring, and it would be gone. A forgotten secret, buried again. But as I stood there, in the middle of my new bedroom, trying to force my breathing back to normal, I couldn't shake the most awful feeling. A feeling that I was being watched. Not from the windows, not from the doorway, but from right beneath my feet. As if, through the thick metal and the old wood, a pair of eyes was looking straight up at me from the cold, silent dark. I wasn't just standing on a floor anymore. I was standing on a ceiling. For a couple of days, I did what any rational, code-driven person would do. I compartmentalized. The trapdoor and its creepy little contents were a closed subroutine. I pushed them to the back of the stack, filed under weird old house stuff to be dealt with later, probably never. To keep my mind occupied, I declared war on the rest of the house. I attacked the dingy yellow countertops in the kitchen with contact paper that looked vaguely like marble if you squinted from another room. I spent an entire afternoon wrestling a new, more efficient toilet into the small bathroom, a job that involved more cursing and leaked water than any YouTube tutorial had prepared me for. I was busy, I was productive, I was deliberately, forcefully, not thinking about what was under my bed. I even started sleeping with a floor fan on, not for the cool air, but for the white noise. A steady, mechanical hum to drown out the silence. It was a conscious choice. I was building a wall of noise and activity between me and that discovery. I told myself it was working. The first time I heard it, I almost missed it. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning. I'd exhausted myself painting the trim in the living room and had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep. Something, a change in the rhythm of the night, pulled me half awake. Over the drone of the fan, there was another sound, a faint, intermittent scratching. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. It was coming from the floor, somewhere near the center of the room. My first thought, the one I clung to like a life raft, was mice. Of course, it's an old house. Old houses have mice. That's what they do. They scratch. Problem solved. My logical brain presented the explanation, and my terrified subconscious gratefully accepted it. I rolled over, pulled the pillow over my head, and forced myself back to sleep, dismissing it as a completely normal, if slightly unwelcome, part of homeownership. But the next night, it was different. I was lying in bed, reading on my phone, the fan humming its tune. The house was settled, the neighborhood was quiet, and then it started again. It wasn't the sharp, frantic scratching of a mouse this time. This was a lower, slower sound, a soft, dragging noise. Shush, shush, shush. It was the sound of something coarse and heavy being pulled across a rough surface. Like a burlap sack, or a pair of old, stiff denim jeans being dragged across packed earth. It would go on for a few feet, then stop. A minute of silence would pass. Then it would start again. Shush, shush, moving from one side of the space beneath me to the other. I need to be clear about this. I'm a programmer. My world is one of if-then statements of cause and effect. A mouse scratches because it's a mouse. A pipe groans because water pressure changes. These are known variables. This sound had no logical variable. It was slow, it was methodical, and the thought that kept circling in my head, the thought that made the hairs on my arms stand up, was that it sounded deliberate. It sounded like someone was moving around down there. Slowly, purposefully, I turned off my phone, plunging the room into darkness. The only light was the faint, orange glow from a streetlight filtering through my blinds. The fan was still on, but now, instead of being a comforting drone, it felt like an obstruction, a wall of sound I had to listen through. I held my breath, straining my ears. Shush, shush, shush. There it was again, closer this time, it seemed. Almost directly beneath me, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The "it's just an old house" excuse was failing, its structural integrity collapsing under the weight of this new, inexplicable data. I debated what to do. Yell? Call out? Pound on the floor? What if it was just a raccoon that had somehow gotten into the crawlspace? I'd look like a fool. But this didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I couldn't just lie there. I couldn't. The not knowing was worse than anything I could imagine. Slowly, carefully, I swung my legs out of bed. I made sure my feet landed on the floor without a sound. The old wood was cool under my bare skin. I crept forward, one silent step at a time, my eyes locked on the spot in the middle of the floor where I knew the trapdoor was hidden. The dragging sound continued, oblivious to my presence. Shush, shush. I was like a predator stalking its prey, except I was the one who was terrified. I got down on my hands and knees, my breath held tight in my chest. The dragging seemed to be right underneath me now. I lowered my head, turning it sideways, until my ear was pressed flat against the dusty floorboards. I was ready to hear it clearly, to finally get a fix on its nature, to gather the evidence I needed to either call an exterminator or my therapist. The second my ear touched the wood, nothing. Dead silence. It didn't just fade away. It stopped, abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped. One moment, the shush shush was there, and the next, gone. All I could hear was the thumping of my own blood in my ears and the distant hum of the fan. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. My cheek pressed against the floor, listening to the absolute, profound absence of sound. The silence was louder than the noise had ever been. It was an intelligent silence. A responsive silence. It was the silence of something that had heard me coming. The silence of something that was now listening back. A wave of cold dread washed over me that was so intense it felt physical, like being dunked in ice water. I scrambled backward, crab walking away from the center of the room until my back hit the wall, my legs tangled in the sheets I'd kicked off the bed. I sat there, gasping for air, staring at an unremarkable patch of wooden flooring in the dark. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Not really. I considered grabbing a pillow and blanket and going to the couch, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like admitting defeat. It felt like conceding that this room was no longer mine. So I sat up in bed, my back against the headboard, the fan now turned off, and I just listened. To the nothing. The hours crawled by. With every normal creak and groan of the house settling, I would flinch. I was a wreck. My mind, deprived of any real input, started to create its own. I kept picturing the drawing on the wall. The tall, skinny stick figure. I imagined it down there, in the dark, dragging that filthy rag doll back and forth, its button eyes scraping against the dirt. A silent, endless playtime in the cold earth. I was exhausted. By the time the first gray light of dawn started to bleed through the blinds, I was physically and emotionally drained. My eyes felt like sandpaper. My whole body ached with tension. I had to work, had to log in and pretend to be a functional human being for 8 hours. The thought was unbearable. My head was starting to nod. My body, in a final act of rebellion against my fearful mind, was shutting down. I slumped against the pillows, my eyelids impossibly heavy. Consciousness was slipping away. I was on the very edge of sleep, that blurry, welcome state of surrender. And that's when I heard the new sound. It wasn't a scratch. It wasn't a drag. It was a single, soft, dry click. It was a precise, metallic sound. The unmistakable sound of a latch, rusty but functional, being carefully, quietly, disengaged from below. For a second, or maybe a full minute, my brain refused to process the sound. The single, dry click. It wasn't a house sound. It wasn't a pipe groaning or wood settling. It was mechanical. It was intentional. It was the sound of a lock being opened. And it came from the floor right in the middle of my bedroom. All the exhaustion, all the tension from the long night of listening, it all vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, uncut adrenaline that felt like ice water in my veins. I was no longer sleepy. I was wide awake, more awake than I'd ever been in my life. I didn't move, I didn't even breathe. My body was completely rigid, my eyes locked on the dark, unremarkable patch of flooring that I knew was hiding it. The trapdoor was unlatched. My mind, which usually runs on logic and code, just went into a blue screen of death kind of error loop. What do you do? What is the procedure for this? There is no procedure for this. Do I scream? Do I run? Do I hide? But where do you run to when the threat is already inside your safest space? Running out of the room felt like turning my back on a predator. I couldn't do it. Slowly, without making a sound, I reached over and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My fingers were clumsy, shaking. I didn't turn it on. I just held it. It felt useless. What was I going to do? Throw it? Then I remembered the baseball bat. The old aluminum Louisville Slugger I'd had since high school. I'd brought it with me when I moved, and right now it was leaning against the wall in the living room. A stupid piece of nostalgia I used to prop the front door open when I was carrying in groceries. Now it felt like the most important object in the entire world. I had to get to it. The plan formed in my head, simple and terrifying. Get out of bed, get to the bedroom door, get the bat, stay in the living room until daylight. It was a journey of maybe 20 feet, but it felt like crossing a minefield. I eased myself out of bed, holding my breath so hard my lungs burned. My bare feet touched the cold wood floor. I paused, listening. Silence. A heavy, waiting silence. The thing down there knew I was up. It had to. It stopped making noise the second I put my ear to the floor last night. It was listening for me, just like I was listening for it. Every step was a calculation. I avoided the boards I knew creaked. I moved like a ghost, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I was convinced the sound was echoing through the whole house. I reached the bedroom door, my hand closing around the cool brass knob. I didn't shut it behind me. I just slipped out into the semi-darkness of the living room. There it was, the bat, leaning right where I'd left it. I've never felt a sense of relief so profound as when my fingers wrapped around the worn grip tape. It was solid, it was real, it was something to put between me and whatever that was. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, the bat held tight in my lap, staring at the dark rectangle of my bedroom doorway. I didn't sleep, I just watched, and I listened. But there were no more sounds. Dawn came slowly, painfully. The gray light that filtered through the blinds felt like a rescue team arriving. Sunlight has a way of making nighttime fears seem irrational, stupid. But the memory of that click was still fresh. It wasn't a dream. I was wrecked. My head throbbed from a lack of sleep and a surplus of adrenaline. My mouth was dry, my eyes felt like they had sand in them. On the nightstand next to my bed, I'd left a half-empty can of Coke. The cheap, sugary caffeine was exactly what I needed to even begin to function. I pushed myself off the couch, the bat still in my hand, and walked stiffly back into the bedroom. The room looked normal. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Just a bedroom, an old, slightly beat-up bedroom in a house I was starting to regret buying. I walked over to the nightstand, my eyes scanning the floor. The trapdoor area looked completely undisturbed. I reached for the soda can. My fingers met empty air. I blinked. I looked again. The nightstand was empty, except for my phone and its charging cable. No can. That's weird. I was sure I left it there. My sleep-deprived brain shrugged. Maybe I finished it last night and threw it away. No, that's not right. I definitely remember leaving it there. It was one of my last thoughts before the dragging sound started. Okay, maybe I'd absent-mindedly taken it to the kitchen at some point. I walked out of the room, through the living room, and into the kitchen. I checked the small countertop. Not there. I opened the trash can. Just coffee grounds and an empty pizza box from 2 nights ago. No Coke can. I checked the fridge, for some reason. Nothing. Irritation was starting to bubble up through the exhaustion and fear. It was just a can of soda, but the misplacement of it felt like another piece of my world that wasn't behaving correctly. It was another variable that didn't compute. I'm losing my mind, I muttered to myself, rubbing my face. I walked back towards the bedroom, feeling defeated. And that's when I saw it. The sun was higher now, its light hitting the floor at a sharp, unforgiving angle. It illuminated things I hadn't been able to see in the dim morning light just moments before. It illuminated the dust, and on the dusty wooden floor, there were marks. My heart didn't just drop. It ceased to exist. For a solid 10 seconds, I just stood there, staring, unable to process what I was seeing. They weren't scuff marks. They weren't smudges. They were footprints. Faint, but unmistakable. They weren't my footprints. I'd been wearing socks or shoes since I'd started working on the house. These were the prints of bare feet. They were long and narrow and caked in a fine, pale dust, the same kind of dry earth dust I'd seen in the hovel under the floor. They looked like they'd been left by someone who had walked through a desert of ash. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. My hands were shaking so badly the baseball bat rattled against the doorframe. I took a step forward, my eyes tracing the path. It was a path, a definite trail. The prints started at the exact spot where the trapdoor was. A perfect outline of a left foot, then a right, materialized out of the floor itself. From there, the trail moved slowly, deliberately, not towards the door, but towards my bed. It went right up to the side of the mattress. I could see 2 overlapping prints right there, right next to the spot where my arm would have been dangling off the edge. The spot where I had slept, where I had lain vulnerable and unconscious for hours. The thing had stood there. It had stood right next to me, watching me sleep. The trail didn't stop there. It continued, making a slow, lazy arc around the foot of the bed, over to the nightstand. There was a small, dusty smudge on the edge of the table itself. Then, the footprints turned, and walked directly back to the center of the room, and disappeared right back into the seam of the trapdoor. I stood frozen in the middle of the trail, a cold, sickening realization washing over me. It was a feeling so violating, so profoundly disgusting, that I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I hadn't misplaced the soda can. I hadn't sleepwalked it to the kitchen. It had been taken. That thing, that person, had crawled up from the dirt below my home. It had crept into my bedroom in the dead of night. It had stood over me, watching me. And then, it had reached out its filthy hand and it had taken my can of Coke. A trophy, a little souvenir from its visit. The absurdity of it was almost as terrifying as the act itself. It didn't take my wallet or my phone, which were right there. It took a half-empty can of soda. The thought of it, down there in the dark, with my can, it was too much. The last vestiges of rationalization, of it being an animal or my imagination, were just obliterated. This was real, this was happening. An intruder hadn't just broken into my house. An intruder was living in my house. Inside the goddamn floors. A switch flipped in my head. Fear turned into a raw, ragged kind of fury. This was my house. I'd poured every cent I had into this place. I'd sunk my sweat and my hopes into these walls. No, absolutely not. I ran out of the room, a new kind of energy coursing through me. In the small spare room that I was planning to turn into an office, there was a heavy, old oak wardrobe the previous owners had left behind. It was a monster, solid wood and probably weighed 300 pounds. I'd been planning to get rid of it. Now, it had a purpose. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed one side of it, digging my fingers into the ornate trim. I grunted, my muscles screaming in protest, and I heaved. It barely budged. I repositioned, putting my back into it, my feet scrabbling for purchase on the floorboards. The wardrobe scraped across the floor with a sound like tearing fabric. Inch by agonizing inch, I pushed and dragged it out of the spare room and into the main bedroom. Sweat was pouring down my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I shoved it towards the center of the room, my sights set on the trapdoor. It was going to be my tombstone, a big, heavy, go to hell, to whatever was living under my feet. With one final, desperate heave that sent a shot of pain through my lower back, I pushed it into place. The corner of the heavy wardrobe landed squarely over the hidden door with a solid, definitive thud. It was done. I stood there, panting, hands on my knees, staring at my handiwork. A 300-pound slab of oak was now sitting on top of the entrance. There was no way anything was getting through that. I felt a flicker of triumph, of control reclaimed. And then, from beneath the floor, from under the immense weight of the wardrobe, a sound came. It wasn't a scratch or a drag. It was a low, guttural, and unmistakably furious growl. A sound of pure, thwarted rage, muffled by the dirt and wood between us. The growl was immediately followed by a single, violent, explosive sound. Whomp! The entire floor beneath my feet jumped. The wardrobe, all 300 pounds of it, visibly lifted an inch off the floor before crashing back down with a deafening boom. A cloud of ancient dust exploded from beneath it. Something down there had just hit the trapdoor from below with incredible, impossible force. And it was angry, very, very angry that I had just locked it in. Or, I suddenly realized with a fresh wave of ice-cold terror, that I had just locked myself in with it. For a long time, I just stood there, rooted to the spot in my own bedroom, my back spasming from the effort of moving the wardrobe. The whole floor had jumped. I'm not exaggerating. A 300-pound piece of solid oak furniture was physically thrown into the air by whatever was underneath it. The furious growl was one thing, that was a sound. But the sheer force of that impact, that was physics. That was raw, terrifying power. And the horrible realization that had settled over me was still there, cold and heavy in my gut. I hadn't locked it in. I had locked myself in with it. The rest of the day was a total write-off. I tried to work. I really did. I sat at the small desk I'd set up in the living room, my laptop open, lines of code I'd written a week ago looking like a foreign language. But I couldn't focus. My body was in the living room, but my mind was in the bedroom, staring at that heavy wardrobe. Every muscle was coiled tight. Every tiny creak of the old house, every pop from the water heater, every car that drove by outside, it all sent a jolt of alarm through me. I kept glancing at the bedroom doorway, half expecting to see the wardrobe start sliding across the floor on its own. But nothing happened. The hours crawled by in absolute, unnerving silence. No more growls. No more thuds. Nothing. And you know how silence can be, sometimes? It can be louder than any noise. The complete absence of sound from under the floor started to mess with my head in a new way. The terror didn't go away, but it started to get diluted. Doubt started to seep in. My logical programmer's brain, the part of me that had been offline for the past 24 hours, started to reboot. Was the growl real? A little voice asked. Or was it the sound of old floor joists groaning under the sudden, immense weight of the wardrobe? Did the wardrobe really lift up? Or did it just settle violently, shifting on the uneven floorboards and making a loud bang? The house was old. I knew it was. The inspector had said so. Houses settle. They make weird noises. Maybe I was just exhausted, sleep-deprived, and my mind, primed by the creepy drawings and the missing Coke can, had filled in the blanks with the most terrifying explanations possible. Maybe it was a raccoon that had gotten trapped, and its frantic scrabbling and rage were just an animal's panic. The footprints, okay, the footprints were harder to explain away, but in the harsh light of day, with the sun streaming in, maybe they were just weird smudges in the dust that my freaked-out mind had interpreted as feet. I hated myself for thinking it, but the possibility felt like a lifeline. I clung to it. The idea that I was just losing my mind was, somehow, less terrifying than the alternative. The alternative was that there was a person, a thing, living in a dirt hole under my bedroom, strong enough to throw furniture around. I preferred the "I'm going crazy" explanation. By late afternoon, the silence had become unbearable. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was a loaded silence. A waiting silence. And I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. It was a stupid, morbid need. The kind of need that makes people in horror movies go into the basement. I had to see. I had to confirm, one way or another, if I was crazy or if I was in real, legitimate danger. So I got up. I grabbed the Louisville Slugger from where it was leaning against the couch. The metal felt cold and solid in my sweating palms. It didn't feel like much of a weapon against something that could bench press a wardrobe, but it was better than nothing. I walked into the bedroom. The room was just as I'd left it. The heavy oak wardrobe sat squarely in the middle of the floor, a silent, monolithic tombstone. I stood there for a minute, just listening. Nothing. I took a deep breath, the air tasting like dust and stale fear. Okay, I whispered to myself. Let's just see. Moving the wardrobe had been hell the first time. The second time was worse. My back was already screaming at me. I put the bat down, got a low stance, and put my shoulder into the wood. I pushed with everything I had. My sneakers slipped on the floorboards. The wardrobe groaned, a deep, woody sound, and scraped backward, maybe an inch. I grunted, repositioned, and pushed again. Another inch. It was agonizing work. It felt like trying to move a mountain. I wasn't trying to move it all the way out, just enough. Just enough to get to the edge of the trapdoor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of straining and sweating, I had moved it about 2 feet. A narrow gap, just enough to access the edge of the hidden door and lift it. The floorboards where it had been sitting were compressed, covered in a thick layer of dust that had been shaken loose by the impact. I picked up the bat again, holding it like I was ready to swing. I knelt down. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My hands were shaking. I used the tips of my fingers to find the almost invisible seam in the wood. I wedged them in and lifted. The trapdoor came up easily, silently. Much more easily than I expected. I held my breath, lifting it just a few inches, peering into the blackness below. It smelled of damp earth, of cellars, of rot. I fumbled for my phone, my thumb swiping clumsily to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the top of the crude wooden ladder that led down. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the dirt walls, the first rung of the ladder. My brain was screaming at me to just slam it shut, push the wardrobe back, and call the police. Tell them what? That my house made a scary noise? But then the beam of light moved down a little, and my blood turned to ice. It wasn't empty. There was something there, placed very carefully, very deliberately, on the top step of the ladder, right in the center, so it would be the first thing anyone saw. It was a piece of old, splintered plywood, about the size of a clipboard, and on it, there was a new drawing. I think I stopped breathing. The whole world just stopped. Time stretched out, getting thin and brittle. It was the same style as the drawings on the wall downstairs. Crude, childish, drawn with what looked like a lump of charcoal. But this one was different. This one was personal. It wasn't a kid playing with a tall stick figure. This drawing was of my bedroom. My bed was there, a lumpy rectangle, and in the bed, there was a little stick figure lying down, clearly asleep. The figure had a scribble of short hair on its head, just like mine. It was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, just like the ones I had slept in. Standing next to the bed, looming over the sleeping figure, was the tall friend. It was just a long, spidery stick figure, but it was drawn to be immense, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Its arms were long, spindly lines that hung down past its knees. It was just standing there, watching. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the plywood. Underneath the horrifying little scene, scrawled in the same messy, almost unreadable letters, were 2 words. New friend. The air left my lungs in a whoosh, as if I'd been punched. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't the house settling. This was a message, a declaration. It had seen me. It knew I'd found its little den. It knew I was scared. It had watched me sleep. It had taken my soda can as a souvenir. And now, it was communicating. It was playing a game. A sick, terrifying game, and I was the new toy. The drawing wasn't a threat in the way a growl was a threat. It was worse. It was intimate. It was a claim. You're mine now. I felt like I was going to throw up. The violation of it all was so profound, so absolute. This thing hadn't just been in my house. It had been studying me. It saw what I wore to bed. It saw how I slept. And it chose to leave me this welcome note. I stayed kneeling there, frozen, staring at the drawing, my mind a complete blank screen of static. The baseball bat felt useless in my hand. What good was a piece of aluminum against this kind of calculated, psychological horror? You can't beat a nightmare with a bat. And that's when the smell hit me. It wasn't the general damp earth smell from before. This was something new, something foul. It was the thick, cloying stench of rot and sweat and unwashed flesh. A smell so heavy it felt like I could taste it on the back of my tongue. It billowed up from the darkness of the hole, a warm, gag-inducing wave of pure filth. Then I heard it. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a scratch. It was a sound from right below me, so close I felt the vibration of it through the floorboards. It was a low, wet, rattling breath. A horrible, gurgling sound, like air being forced through fluid-filled lungs. H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. It was the sound of something waking up, or maybe the sound of something that had been waiting patiently, right there in the dark, just below the door, the whole time. My mind screamed a single, coherent thought: slam it shut. I lurched forward, my hands reaching for the edge of the heavy wooden door. But I was too slow. Before my fingers could even touch it, the trapdoor exploded upwards. It wasn't pushed gently, it was slammed from below with vicious, terrifying force. The edge of the heavy wood caught my right hand, smashing my knuckles against the floor and sending a bolt of white-hot pain up my arm. The baseball bat flew from my grasp, clattering uselessly across the room. The trapdoor swung wide open, crashing against the floor beside the hole, revealing the gaping, black maw beneath my home. Pain was the first thing to cut through the static in my head. A sharp, white-hot explosion in my right hand, a sickening crunch of bone and flesh caught between heavy wood and the unyielding floor. The pain was so immediate, so total, that for a split second, it eclipsed the fear. I vaguely registered the sound of the Louisville Slugger skittering across the floorboards, a hollow metal sound that seemed a million miles away. My only weapon, gone. I was on my knees, cradling my mangled hand, my head swimming. My nervous system was screaming two messages at me at once: hand is broken and run. And then I looked up. There was no more door. Just a hole, a perfect, black, 3 by 3 foot square of absolute nothingness cut into the floor of my bedroom. The heavy oak trapdoor itself had been thrown with such impossible force that it had slammed against the floor beside the opening, the sound of its impact echoing the one that had broken my hand. It lay there like an open coffin lid. The smell, that god-awful, thick, hot stench of a zoo cage and a rotting cellar, was everywhere now. It wasn't just coming up from the hole, it filled the entire room, crawling into my sinuses, coating the back of my throat. It was the smell of something that had never seen the sun, something that had lived and slept and breathed and festered in the damp earth. And the sound. H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. That wet, rattling breath was no longer muffled. It was clear as a bell, coming from just inside the pit. So close. I was kneeling maybe 4 feet from the edge of the abyss, and the thing living inside it was awake and right there. I think, for a full 5 seconds, my brain just shut down. It was a complete system overload. The kind of fear that's so pure it doesn't even feel like fear anymore. It's just a blank, roaring whiteness behind the eyes. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My lungs had seized up, forgotten how to work. That's when the survival instinct, that primal lizard part of the brain that doesn't care about logic or reason, finally kicked the door down. It bypassed all the higher functions and screamed a single command to my limbs: go. I didn't stand up. I couldn't. I scrambled backwards, pushing with my good hand and my feet, my back scraping against the floor. My jeans caught on a loose floorboard nail, and the ripping sound was like a gunshot in the thick, waiting silence. I kicked my leg free and kept going, crab walking desperately, never taking my eyes off that black square. I couldn't see anything inside it, just the perfect, geometric darkness, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching me. When my back hit the bedroom doorframe, I used it to lurch to my feet. My legs were like jelly. My right hand throbbed with a nauseating, pulsing rhythm that matched the frantic beat of my heart. I didn't look back, I just turned and ran. I burst into the living room, the slightly cleaner air a shock to my system. My mind was a blizzard of panic, but one coherent, practical thought managed to push its way through: keys. Wallet, phone was in my pocket, but I needed the keys. The car keys. I couldn't be trapped here. The small wooden console table was by the front door. I could see them, a small silver glint in the dim light filtering through the windows. I lunged for the table, my good hand, my left, fumbling for the keychain. My fingers were slick with sweat. They kept slipping. The keys felt impossibly small and complex. Behind me, the house was silent. A thick, predatory silence. Maybe it wasn't following. Maybe it was staying in its den. For a half second, a flicker of insane hope ignited in my chest. Maybe it won't come out. That hope was instantly, violently extinguished. Crack, thump, scree. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't just a noise. I felt it through the soles of my shoes, a deep vibration that shuddered through the entire house. It came from the bedroom. It was the sound of my solid wood bed frame, the one I'd spent hours assembling, being shattered. It was the sound of something immense and powerful launching itself out of the hole with no regard for anything in its path. I froze, keys clutched in my trembling hand. I couldn't help it. I had to look. It was the stupidest thing I could have done, but my body turned before my brain could stop it. I looked back down the short hallway into the bedroom doorway, and I saw it. It was framed perfectly in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim gloom of the bedroom beyond. The drawing hadn't done it justice. Tall friend was an understatement. It was unnaturally, horribly tall, its head nearly brushing the top of the doorframe. And it was thin, so thin it looked like a skeleton wrapped in pale, dirty skin. The skin, from what I could see, was a sickly, subterranean white, streaked with dirt and grime. Its hair was long, black, and hung in greasy, matted ropes that obscured most of its face. It wore nothing but a pair of torn, filthy trousers. It didn't speak. It just stood there for a heartbeat, its long, spindly arms hanging down past its knees. Then its head tilted, a jerky, bird-like motion. It made a sound, not a growl, not anymore. It was a low, wet, clicking sound from the back of its throat, like a predator tasting the air. From the curtain of foul hair, I saw a glint. Two glints. Eyes. They caught the faint light from the living room and shone with a flat, mindless hunger. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It sort of unfolded. It lurched forward, one long, stick-like leg at a time, but it moved with a speed that was utterly wrong for its emaciated frame. It was fast, horribly, terrifyingly fast. In 2 strides, it was out of the bedroom and into the hallway, its bare feet making wet, slapping sounds on the hardwood floor. That broke my paralysis. I screamed. Finally, it wasn't a word, just a raw, animal noise of pure terror torn from my throat. I spun around, my back to the creature, and clawed at the front door. The keys. I had the keys. My smashed right hand was useless, a dead weight of agony. I jammed the key toward the deadbolt with my shaking left hand. Missed. The slapping footsteps were closer now. So close. I could hear its breathing, that same wet, rattling sound, but now it was strained with effort. I tried again. My fingers felt like clumsy sausages. The key scraped against the metal plate. Come on, come on, come on. The thought was a frantic prayer in my head. I could smell it now. That thick, unholy stench was right behind me, a choking cloud of filth and decay. It was so close I could feel the air shifting as it moved. The key slid into the lock. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made my knees buckle. I turned it. The deadbolt made a loud, satisfying chunk as it unlocked. Yes, now the handle. Just the handle. I was going to make it. I was going to throw myself out onto the lawn and run and never, ever look back. My fingers wrapped around the cold brass of the doorknob. I started to turn it. The world outside the small window in the door, the peaceful, quiet street, the neighbor's porch light, was my salvation. It was 3 feet away. Then something grabbed my ankle. It wasn't a human grip. It was cold, hard, and immensely strong. The grip of a vice made of bone. Long, impossibly long fingers wrapped completely around my leg, the nails, or whatever they were, digging into my skin through my jeans. The forward momentum I had was instantly arrested. I was yanked backward with incredible force. My feet went out from under me, my grip on the doorknob torn away. My head hit the floor with a dull thud that sent stars exploding behind my eyes. The air was driven from my lungs in a painful whoosh. I landed flat on my back, stunned, staring up at the ceiling of my own living room. For a moment the world was a blurry, spinning mess. Then the creature was standing over me, a looming, skeletal tower of filth. I saw its face then, as its head dipped down. The matted hair parted slightly, revealing a narrow, chinless jaw, pale lips pulled back from gray teeth, and those eyes. They were wide, wild, and utterly devoid of anything I recognized as human. They were the eyes of a starving animal. It didn't try to stomp on me, it didn't try to hit me. It did something worse. It bent down, its other hand clamping onto my other leg. And it started to drag me. The sheer horror of that moment is something I don't think I'll ever be able to properly explain. The fight wasn't a fight. It was just over. I was helpless. I kicked and flailed with my arms, my one good hand scrabbling for purchase on the smooth floorboards, but it was useless. It was like a child trying to fight an adult. The strength was absolute. It dragged me backwards, my head bumping along the floor. The sound was horrible. The scrape of my clothes, the thud of my skull against the wood. My view was of the front door, my one hope of escape, getting smaller and smaller. The cool night air I had almost tasted was gone, replaced by the hot, foul breath of the thing that was pulling me back into the heart of its darkness. Back towards the bedroom, back towards the hole in the floor. My head was a drum, the steady, sickening thump 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 against the floorboards marking a rhythm for my own death. My vision was a fisheye lens of the living room ceiling, the familiar water stain in the corner now looking like a monstrous, leering face. The front door, my beautiful, solid oak front door with its little window showing the free world, was getting smaller. Farther away, it was dragging me, it was actually dragging me back to the hole. Panic is a funny thing. For all the freezing up, for all the screaming, there's another level. It's a white-hot, fizzing energy that has no thought behind it. It's just pure, animal survival. My good hand, my left, was scrabbling uselessly against the polished wood, my fingernails finding no purchase. My legs kicked, but the thing's grip on my ankles was like iron. My broken right hand was just a passenger, a throbbing, screaming sack of pain dangling at my side. I was going to die. The thought wasn't even dramatic. It was a simple, factual statement in my head, like noticing the sky is blue. I am being dragged into a hole in the floor by a monster and I am going to die. My flailing left hand hit something. It wasn't the floor. It was cool, smooth, and cylindrical. Heavy. The bat, the Louisville Slugger. It had slid under the small armchair near the hallway. I hadn't even seen it. It was a miracle, a 1 in a million shot. My fingers, clumsy and slick with sweat, closed around the metal handle. There was no time to think, no time to plan a heroic comeback. I was on my back, I was moving backwards, and the thing was right behind me, its foul, hot breath washing over my face. So I just swung. It was a blind, desperate, over-the-shoulder heave. I put every ounce of terror and adrenaline I had into it. I didn't aim. I didn't even really know where the thing was, other than behind me. I just swung the bat back over my head in a wide, reckless arc. There was a wet, solid crunch. It was a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't the sound of hitting wood or metal. It was the sound of hitting meat and bone. It was followed instantly by a shriek. Not a human shriek. It was a high-pitched, guttural sound of pure agony, like a fox caught in a trap. The grip on my ankles vanished. For a second, I was still sliding backwards from the momentum, but I was free. I scrambled, turning over, planting my feet on the floor. I didn't look to see what I'd hit. I didn't try for a second swing. The thought never even crossed my mind. The part of my brain that was still working knew one thing. That was my one and only chance. You don't fight the monster twice. I surged to my feet. My legs were screaming, my body was a mess of bruises, but I ran. I ran those 10 feet to the front door like my entire life was compressed into that single sprint. I didn't fumble with the keys this time. The deadbolt was already unlocked. My hand slammed onto the doorknob, turned it, and I threw my entire body weight against the door. It burst open, and I tumbled out onto my own small porch, the cool night air hitting my face like a splash of ice water. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I didn't stop. I scrambled down the 2 concrete steps onto the lawn and I just screamed. I don't know what I screamed. It probably wasn't even words. It was just a raw, tearing sound from the bottom of my lungs, a signal to the universe that something was horribly, biblically wrong in this quiet little house. And that's when the second miracle of the night happened. Headlights. Bright, blinding, beautiful headlights swept across my front lawn. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was just pulling into his driveway. His car, a sensible Toyota Camry, came to a slow stop. And its lights were pointed directly at my open front door. From inside the house, the shriek had turned into a series of panicked, wet clicks and growls. In the perfect rectangle of light cast by the headlights, I saw it. It was back in the hallway, blinking, stunned by the sudden brightness. Its form was silhouetted, a tall, skeletal horror story caught in the spotlight. It looked from the light to me on the lawn, and then back into the darkness of the house. It hesitated for a split second. My screaming finally found a word. Help! I heard a car door slam. Mr. Henderson's voice, shaky but loud. Jesus Christ, I'm calling 911. That was it. That was the final trigger. The creature did not want the attention. It moved, and God, it was fast. It didn't run, it crawled. It dropped to all fours and scurried back towards the bedroom with the unnatural speed of a spider, its long limbs moving in a way that was fundamentally wrong. Then it was gone, back in the dark. I stayed on the lawn, shaking, sobbing, clutching my broken hand to my chest. I stared at my open front door, at the welcoming yellow light of my living room, and I couldn't imagine ever stepping back inside. The next hour was a blur of flashing lights and official voices. 2 police cars, then an ambulance. They wrapped me in a scratchy blanket. Paramedics looked at my hand, their faces grim, and carefully splinted it before helping me into the back of the ambulance. I answered questions from a police officer, a woman with a kind but tired face. My answers were disjointed, nonsensical. The drawings, a tall friend, it was under the floor. I'm sure I sounded insane. They wouldn't let me leave, not until they had cleared the house. They went in with flashlights and guns drawn. I just sat in the ambulance, the door open, watching. Watching the place that was supposed to be my dream home get cordoned off with yellow tape like a murder scene. It felt like forever before a detective, a guy in a rumpled suit named Miller, came over to the ambulance. He had a look on his face I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity, it was something else. Something weary. We got him, he said, his voice low. He was down there, didn't put up a fight. Malnourished, dehydrated, probably hasn't seen the sun in years. Looks like a transient who got lucky finding a place to hide. Relief washed over me so hard I felt dizzy. A transient, a homeless man, a sick, crazy homeless man. It was terrifying, yes, but it was understandable. It was a problem with a solution. A man can be arrested. A man can be put in jail. It was over. Thank you, I croaked. Oh my God, thank you. Miller just nodded slowly, his eyes still on my face. He wasn't done. You're lucky that neighbor came home when he did. The thing is, son, we were checking out the space where he was living. The cellar? He shook his head. It's not just a cellar. It's not on any blueprint for this house. He dug it. We think he's been digging for a very, very long time. He paused, letting that sink in. And it doesn't just stay under your house. I stared at him, not understanding. The static was coming back into my head. The tunnel system, Miller continued, his voice dropping even lower, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. It's a network. Crude, but it's there. It connects to the crawlspace under this house. And it also connects to the crawlspace of the house next door. And the one next to that. And it has an access point that leads up into the shared attic space of the block. I just sat there, the ambulance, the flashing lights, the concerned faces of the paramedics, it all faded away. All I could see was Miller's grim mouth. All I could hear was his voice. We found his nest, he said, and the word made my stomach clench. Down in the main chamber, right under your bedroom. He had a mattress made of old insulation and newspapers. And he had a collection of little things. My heart, which had just started to slow down, began to hammer against my ribs again. A cold, deep dread started to bloom in my chest, far worse than the panic I'd felt before. This was a different kind of fear, a slow, creeping, intellectual horror. What kind of things? I whispered. Miller pulled out a small notebook. Forensics is still bagging it all up, but the initial report, it's a history of this block. We found a silver hair clip, the kind that was popular in the 90s. A faded Polaroid of a family having a barbecue, date on the back says 1984. A single baby shoe, probably from the family that lived here before you. He's been here for decades. Watching, a secret member of the neighborhood. He looked up from his notebook, and his eyes met mine. The weariness in them was profound. He was just observing, taking little souvenirs from all the friends he made over the years. You were just the newest one. He flipped a page, and my blood ran cold. We also found a half-empty can of soda, a Coke. We found it sitting on a little rock, like a trophy. He looked at me. You a Coke drinker, son? I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my entire body numb. The lawn nook and go. The soda can from my nightstand. It wasn't a random break-in. It wasn't a squatter. It was a parasite. A human parasite that had been living in the walls and under the floors of this street for longer than I'd been alive. The drawings, the tall friend, that wasn't from some long-dead child. That was him. He was the tall friend. He'd been playing this game for years. The sounds, the missing items, it wasn't just happening to me. How many families had heard a strange scratching in the night and just dismissed it as rats? How many people had misplaced a small, sentimental object and never thought twice about it? He hadn't attacked me because he wanted to rob me. He'd attacked me because I found his door. I had broken the rules of his secret little world. I never went back to that house. Not once. My parents helped me get what little stuff was salvageable. The police reports, the eventual trial, it's all a blur. The man's name was Arthur. He had no record, no family. He was a ghost long before he decided to live in a hole. They sent him to a psychiatric facility. End of story, right? I live in an apartment now. A new one, on the 3rd floor. Concrete floors, concrete ceilings. As safe as it gets. I'm 1,000 miles away from that street. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet, I'll be lying in bed. And I'll hear something, a faint sound from the apartment next to mine. A floorboard creaking, the muffled sound of a television. Normal sounds, the sounds of people living their lives. And I freeze. My eyes snap open in the dark and I stare at the wall. The plain, white, solid wall that separates my life from my neighbors. And I can't help but wonder, how many walls are truly solid? How many friends are out there, living in the spaces in between, just quietly watching us?